I didn't write, quite consciously, I didn't write sort of a blueprint for what people should do. It's not like, look at these movements, they were successful, now you can do it, just copy their methods. That would be it's the exact opposite. The message I have is, dream. I cannot tell you how to dream. I can only say, have the courage to do that. So my name is Joachim Heberlein. I have written this book, which you can't quite see right now. Beauty is in the Street, a history of protesting and countercultures in post-war Europe. A book that sort of covers both sides of the Iron Curtain, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and tells the story of the multifaceted kinds of protesting, the kinds of struggles in the streets, but also beyond streets, the forms of protesting in which people were involved, to give readers a sense of what protesting, can actually accomplish, and a sense of the courage of those who were protesting and engaging, often experiments of not just struggling for a better world, but trying to imagine and to build a better world in the here and now, engaging in experiments, trying things out, sometimes succeeding, often failing, and then thinking again why they failed, trying again, and getting a sense of this experimentation. That's sort of the book in a nutshell, I think.
Yeah.
The book is composed of 4 parts and a coda at the end. It starts off with 2 chapters that are called Setting the Scene, one about roughly the 1950s, early 1960s, different kinds of youth movements back then, and then a long chapter, the longest in the book, about the famous moment of 1968 in 4 different countries, West Germany, France, Italy, and Czechoslovakia. Then there are 3 major parts. Part 2 is called Forms of Protest, that deals with very different ways in which people engage in protesting, ranging from violence, deadly violence in the form of terrorism, to mocking the authorities, so a bit more of a hilarious form of protesting, very much a contrast to this violence, to theory as a way of criticizing authority, to music as a form of protesting. So that's the first or second part, forms of protesting. Then a third part deals with different movements and campaigns, for example, international solidarity campaigns, campaigns against racism, the better worlds of the peace and environmental movements, the better worlds they try to create in camps they set up. It's about urban activism then, and the women and the gay movements. And the final part then looks at a better life, the here and now. So 3 chapters on how people tried to live a better life and to create a better world in the present, by dwelling differently, working, traveling differently, but also engaging what I call emotional politics. And finally, I think very interesting topics, very rarely talked about in the context of protesting, and that is alternative spirituality. So New Age followers who were in some countries part of that protesting scene. And it closes with a coda on the peaceful revolutions of 1989 throughout communist Eastern Europe, starting in Poland, but then also in chapter deals with the GDR and then Czechoslovakia. So in many ways, the book really rests on the tremendous and fascinating research that other people have done. I wanted to actually mention, to start off with a book that I really loved. And it's a bit of an obscure book. I think it's published in English by Automedia. There's an English translation of it. It's called The Lives of the Orange Man, about the Orange Alternative, a movement from Poland. So it's published originally in Polish, and tells the story of a small group of sort of countercultural activists in Krakow in Poland in the 1980s, who staged all kinds of fairly hilarious happenings that mocked authorities rather than challenging them openly. My favorite story is how they ask who's afraid of toilet paper in communist Poland, and because it was a scarce good there and people were lining to get toilet paper. And obviously the regime, or apparently the regime, was scared by toilet paper because it arrested all of these activists just because they were talking about toilet paper. So it's a book that in a way gives hope, because it shows how really small actions can undermine authority, how small actions can take away fear of the police. So people got arrested. They were searching their bags, looking for happy pills that were mints, and so you went there, you were arrested, but after a day or two, they sent you home. Nothing bad happened, and so people lost fear of the regime. And in a way, that spirit, I think, sort of informed large chunks of the book, at least. Even if the book isn't, only a section of the book is really about that movement. So a variety of other books that portrayed people who were engaged in all kinds of often very creative forms of protesting. So these kinds of books are the basis for my book. Maybe I can mention one more that is unfortunately, really unfortunately, out of print. It's called Common Women, Uncommon Practices, about the queer spaces of Creenham Commons, a famous site of protesting in 1980s Britain against nuclear armament. And it was a women's protest camp there. But not only against nuclear armament, but also a space for experimenting and questioning and sort of destabilizing gender and sexualized identities. So these kinds of books, and there would be plenty more to mention about protesting in Italy, in West Germany, in France, where people started trying to do something differently, not just protesting against authorities, but trying to live a different life in these situations of protesting. That's sort of the stuff that went into, on which the book rests, as it were. At the same time, it's also written, if you want, a bit against some sort of trends in how people write history, not necessarily about writing histories of protesting, but more generally, I was thinking about the why of history. Why should we write? Why should we bother about history? And there are many books that I call, with a bit of polemical tone, maybe sort of enemy analysis. So trying books about all things that went wrong, all the bad things in the world, to put it a bit bluntly. And if you think about history, one certainly legitimate reason to be interested in history is to understand in a way what went wrong in the past. Right? We study fascism, we study the history of Nazism, because we don't want that to happen ever again, obviously. And they're good. That's a good reason to study the history of Nazism, or to teach the history of Nazism, for that matter. But the kinds of books I read for this book, for Beauty in the Street, books like The Life of the Orange Man, like the work of what I mentioned earlier, Common Women, Uncommon Practices. To me, they are not just a lesson in history that teaches us what not to do again, what to avoid, what to be vigilant about, but that is an inspiration for the present. And it's books that provide inspiration. That I find, or that's what I find fascinating about the history of protesting, and then about books about that history that can provide inspiration. And these are the kinds of books that I hope people will read, if they're not the books that often make the bestseller lists, but wonderful little gems often. In a way, when I was teaching at the University of Warwick for years, a class on the politics of protesting. And in many ways, the book's indebted to that class. And one thing my students, who are 20 years or so, 15, 20 years younger than I am, one thing they voiced, and I found that fascinating, was a sense that in the 1970s, 1980s, that's really the time that most of the stories of the book is about, that back then it was possible to experiment. And nowadays they feel it's impossible to make any mistake, because everything is recorded for eternity on social media, and everything has to be perfect for your CV. And just trying out something, maybe failing, doing something different the next time, that has become very difficult, they feel. Now, that might be a bit of a romanticized view on the 1970s. Yeah, any historian I would tell that would be a bit concerned about their image of the 1970s. It was not all that good. Having said that, if that particular sort of lens on the 1970s, that through these alternative cultures and their courage to try out things, to experiment, in a way that seemed to resonate with them, and it seemed to resonate with them at a moment when it became very difficult to experiment and to have that courage. And so it came out of that teaching experience. And so I wanted to write a book that in a way responded to their sense of unease and said, okay, look, here are stories worth reading, worth learning about that, might inspire you to have that courage, not just to care about your CV all the time.
What are the ideas or the thinking that you were hoping that people would take from the book?
So this really is really the sense of having a courage to try something. I mean, it's of we were talking, if I can refer back to our conversation we had to migration politics and the current mood about migration, the current success of right-wing parties. And one study that I read in a German context said that those who are voting for extreme right-wing parties, they're not necessarily longing for a past that never existed. They're not just looking backwards for some great times. I don't know. In the British case, might be the Great British Empire or whatever. But again, that's the case for Germany that someone made, that they have what they called a nihilistic rage. They just they cannot imagine anything better in the future. And that's what's sort of fueling much of the hatred we see right now and much of the sort of success of right-wing politics. And in a way, the book is, that study came out after I'd written the book, but I felt like, okay, this is exactly what I'm trying to do in my book, and what I hope that readers will take away intellectually is a hope to imagine something better, and a hope and seeing the possibility that, it's possible, it can actually work to come together. I mean, one of the because we are talking about migration, one of the, to me, inspiring and beautiful moments and aspects of some of these struggles, especially those organized by migrants, is that they brought people with very different backgrounds, from very different walks of life, together, where people overcame differences. It didn't always work. Yeah, just again, one shouldn't romanticize all these struggles. They were often fraught with problems, sometimes with racism in these anti-racist movements. But sometimes it worked. Sometimes people stepped out and overcame their prejudices and started working together, talking to each other, and build a community and struggle for something. Sometimes successfully, sometimes not. But these are the beautiful moments. And what I would like readers to take away is to have a sense of, okay, it's worth trying, even if it doesn't work out the way we hoped for in the end, but it's worth trying. I mean, what makes history to me fascinating is that people do things that you don't quite expect them to do. And that's what often happens in these protests. People do things, they start protesting against something, they start building coalitions, and you think, oh, wow, that is something I did not quite expect. And sometimes in very small ways, I don't know, they start painting stairs in Istanbul, and it beautifies the city. Okay, it's amazing. The other day I read about someone in the GDR. I think he produced some sort of graffiti without even any political message, but he went around and turned this dull and gray everyday life into something for a moment more beautiful. I can't tell people what exactly to do. That's the nature of the thing. I can record them. I can be fascinated by what people have done. So I can't quite say, act that way. It's more about, risking something and risking and not wanting to be perfect. That's a fascinating moment is when people tried things and when people, debated what to do next, how to proceed, and not just debated, but then, made an effort to try something, failed. And I think that sort of spirit of experimenting, that's the message in a way, but I can't tell people how to experiment. That would be sort of absurd. I wanted to show you the other book that I wrote.
Yes, Citizens and Refugees.
Yeah, that I wrote more or less while I was writing Beauties on the Street. It came out a year earlier then with Routledge. So the paperback version is as expensive as the hardcover version with Penguin. But I don't know, maybe try to get a copy of it.
Yeah.
It's it's a more personal book in some ways. It might be interesting to readers who come to your bookshop, because it tells stories of, so I've started slightly differently. In 2015, 2016, I was involved in what became known as this welcoming culture in Germany. So I got to help, supported people who came from Syria, from Afghanistan, befriended some of them, and was very interested in the stories they were telling and how these stories in a way challenged the way we tend to think about migration and which kind of stories are included when we think about migration. Because in a way, the very framework of framing stories in terms of migration has itself an exclusionary effect because it excludes the stories that happened before migration. The leading character in this book, a woman from Afghanistan, asks, okay, tell me your story, basically. When does it begin? And one fascinating aspect, it's a very interesting story overall, but she ended the moment when she left Afghanistan. So the migration experience was something she did not consider sort of important telling, actually. It was a different story that mattered to her. So I don't know. It's probably not a book that, because it's so expensive, the paperback version, £35, that many people will buy. It's published by a very academic publisher. But it might be something that,
Yes.
in a way, it's even a more political book, speaking more to the
Yeah.
press, that people find interesting. So I wanted to
No,
advertise
thank
that
you.
book.
Thank you.
In a way, it's personally
And
dear
so
to me.
is it a collection of reflections and accounts from people?
So it's a bit of a weird book. It's
I detect a pattern.
in some ways, it's a reflection on what citizenship means and what citizenship can mean, by telling the stories that people, and they very consciously don't say refugees right now, that people who fled from Afghanistan or Syria and came to Germany, by the stories they tell about their lives. So it starts off my starting point was, in a way, a history of that, what some people have called Summer of Migration, 2015 into 2016. But the way people told me their stories challenged this spotlight, or put the spotlight away from migration to very different stories about struggles for citizenship in Afghanistan, in Syria. And because my sense is that, when we talk about migration and struggles around migration, the struggles of those who came to Europe for democracy, for citizenship in Syria or in Afghanistan, they tend to fall under the table, right? We talk about people crossing borders, people challenging border regimes, people being excluded, facing racism here, and so on. But whatever happened before they became migrants isn't quite interesting. And the case, in a way, I want to make is that if you want to think also about our democracy, about what citizenship means in the West, we should listen to what those who came here have to say about, in a way, citizenship or democracy. It always felt to me meant something very deeply, to people who struggled for these things in places that were very hostile to where democracy was not a given, right? In Great Britain, in Germany, democracy is in a way a given. Of course, we're living in democracy, and it's fine and nice, and maybe it's in danger, but it's a given. We don't have, yeah. And for someone who grew up in Afghanistan, who grew up in Syria, it resonated much more deeply. It felt to me, and so it's a case for listening to these stories about struggles for citizenship that I think can be meaningful in our Western context. Because I think, even in the left, and that I find stunning, they talk about, again, the exclusion that these people face, but what their struggles, that their struggles might be politically relevant for us, that appears very rarely. There's a book, I think I actually start with that, by a Guardian journalist, forgot the name right now, The New Odyssey, it's called, about the refugee crisis. And it starts with telling the story of a man who's on a boat to Europe, in a very horrible, very terrifying situation. And at the end of the book, so you read the book and you feel like, oh, this poor guy. That's how it starts. And then at the end of the book, and I thought this was really telling, this Syrian refugee has a chance sort of to tell his own story, basically. And he says, well, my story, and he's introduced as someone who's not really a hero, just a very ordinary Syrian.
Right.
And I think in an effort to stir empathy. And the book ends with his story, and his story is, okay, actually, we went to the streets and fought for democracy in Syria. That's when it all started.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was just such a contrast to the way the journalist was telling the story. And I think, okay, listen to actually, he tells a very different story, and that's worth listening to. And we have to think about why these stories are worth listening to. So that's in a way what I'm trying to do in that book. So I tried to sell it to more trade publishers. That didn't work out. But it's in a way it's written for non-academics.
Right.
So it's not jargon heavy or anything.
Okay.
It's a very easy read. That's at least what people who have read the book told me. And that's one thing I tried to do in the book is sort of to incorporate the moment of telling the story into the writing. I gave the little chapters there, it structures into little chapters about individuals. And I gave each person their chapter to read. And some of them just said, "Oh yeah, it's fine, just go ahead." And okay. Sabrina, the starting story, the woman from Afghanistan, I think the original version was 3,000 words. And then she was like, "Okay, here you have to correct that bit, and here you have to explain more." And in the end, it was 6,000 words. And then I said, "Okay, listen, I have to tell you, there's some limitations, and
Yeah.
we had a bit of a negotiation, but it's in that sense a collective, sometimes more, sometimes less collectively
Right.
written. I really
Yeah.
made an effort to say, okay, this is your story. I don't want to write anything that you don't want to be in
Right.
there, to be in there. And the other interesting thing was that some people, and it was amazing how often stories ended up, we were having conversations in coffee shops, and
Mm.
oftentimes I knew the people who were telling me the stories. I remember one particular case, I think we talked for 4 hours, and 2 of these hours were spent on talking about his current love affair that had gone sour. That didn't go into the book because I think that's, not, that should be remain. But I think, had he told me a story on a happier day, he might have told me a very different story. And he
Right.
also, if you were Syrian, he said to me, I would have told you a very different story because Syrians know the story. So,
Okay.
and I try to sort of catch these moments, okay, the moment of storytelling and to whom you are telling a story
Mm.
actually really matters.
Yeah.
And if you do oral history interviews, that often falls under the table because it seems like we just record the story, period.
Right.
But it's the stories are told in very concrete situations, and stories are also told. And something I learned from writing that book actually, that history isn't just what we do in a classroom, or the teaching of history isn't, but people are telling stories all the time, and in a way
Right.
that's history, and negotiating which stories they can tell on a coffee table, or while having dinner or whatever, or it's a very specific situation when you're having your asylum case hearing, and
Mhm.
then you have to tell a very specific story, and you have to highlight your suffering, your victimhood
Mhm.
in a way, and other things have to fall on the table. So thinking about sort of the context of the storytelling.
Mhm.